Hi, I'm Greg Farrar, and this is my, well, not even close to daily COVID-19 live stream. Talk about COVID-19 trends at the country, state, and county level, countries of the world, states of the United States, and counties of California. That's my focus. I'm using this new version or way of streaming through YouTube. I just want to take a minute to see if I actually seem to be streaming. Yes, I do. All right, so I think we're in business. If you drop something in the chat, I think I'll see it. That would be nice. So I know you're there. Anyway, let's get to it. So, no, not the California trends. Let's start with the countries. We'll do the countries first, and then we'll do the states of the United States, and then we'll do the counties of California. Each segment is typically about 15 minutes long. So it's been a while. Last time I came here, we were having rapid rise, a couple weeks ago maybe, in cases in the United States, and the rest of the world wasn't doing great, but the United States really seemed to be doing poorly. And I said, let's wait and see if it gets better. It didn't, and as we'll see in great detail in the coming hour. However, let's look at the countries. There is still hope. If other countries are better, at least that's something. Are they, though? I'm going to turn this on Do Not Disturb so I stop getting notifications. Well, this graph is really very interesting. This is the severity graph of countries. At least I think it's interesting. The severity graph of countries, severity is a metric that I use, my own metric, which is a combination of daily cases per million and growth rate. So if something has a whole lot of cases adjusted for population, a country, a region, or a city, a country, a state, or a county, I should say, if a particular place has a whole lot of cases, they will tend to have higher severity. Also, if they have a very high growth rate, if their cases are growing a lot, they will tend to have a high severity. And the severity will be worst if both of those are true. Something that has, after adjusting for population, a very high number of cases, in other words, a large number of daily cases per million, one of my favorite metrics, daily cases per million, or if it has a very large growth rate, like say more than 20% a week of growth, I would call a large growth rate. Those will tend to drive the severities up. So severities had this amazing peak. I tend to think of 200 as severity as kind of bad, maybe 400. In the daily cases per million, I call something a hotspot if it has 200 daily cases per million, and severity has kind of that same baseline, but then gets adjusted by growth rate. So severities tend to be a little bit higher than DCPM, but still 200 pretty bad. 400, somewhere in the 200-400 range is probably a severity hotspot. I think I've been calling a severity hotspot 200. Well, as you can see in this graph, I don't know whether my hotspot term is behind the time or whether something else is going on, but 200 is just laughably low nowadays. It seems like all the 20 worst, most severe countries are above 500, all of them. And some of them are peaking in ranges we've just never seen. Back in the day, when the United States was doing relatively poorly before it started doing even worse, we were seeing 500 as a severity, which, no, that's actually 250. We're seeing 250 as severity, which was pretty bad. But now we have all these countries that have just gone completely wild with their severity and into the thousands. Slovenia, Czech Republic, Switzerland, Georgia, Austria. That European epicenter we talked about 2 weeks ago. But the good news is they've pretty much all recovered from that. They're not by any means not hotspots anymore. They're still hotspots, but at least they're not in this super spike area they were. All 5 of these, or 6, or however many of these are, that had a really strong spike around October 31st or so, around the end of October, all of them have dramatically improved in severity. So that's good news. But some haven't. Austria still doing quite poorly. with a severity in the 1400s. And again, these numbers are just all kind of off the scale from the scale that I was using 3 months ago, where 200 was considered a hot spot. I would still say that 200 is a hot spot. We just have a whole lot of hot spots, and I don't know, I need a new category. White hot spot, center of the sun spot. United States, not looking good. It had its peak in July-ish, and now it's just shooting straight upwards. The United States has just been looking continually bad, accelerating. There's just almost nothing good to say about the COVID-19 status of the United States right now. I guess one thing you could say about it, though, is it is this one. It is better than most of the really bad countries in severity. Okay, moving on to daily cases per million, my classic metric. Again, 200 is a hot spot. We don't have a single one of the top 20 countries that is below 400. So similarly to severity, we're seeing unprecedented cases, and as we'll see, we're also seeing unprecedented growth in cases. But the number of cases we're seeing now is extraordinary. If we were to go through, I had this thing last time where this graph is empty. It's just too bad, because this graph actually lets us go back to see all the countries and see, were there other countries ever that were above 1,000? I think the answer is yes, maybe. Qatar, Bahrain back in the day were indeed above 1,000. So this isn't a totally unprecedented number of cases adjusted for population, but it's still just as bad as that previous spike. Also worth noting, the United States, I keep saying, is really bad, and it is, but that's relative to how the United States has been. If you compare it right now to the other states, other countries of the world, it barely makes the top 20. The United States right now is at 400 daily cases per million. 200 makes it a hot spot, which it barely made on its first or its second ripple. I do consider this whole thing to be one wave. It's a wave that we've never recovered from. But so we're still on our first wave as the United States, but this is a much higher ripple than the ones that we've seen, the two that we saw before. But that said, all of these countries listed here on the right are doing worse. Switzerland, Czech Republic, they're kind of a list of European countries. And so Europe as the epicenter continues to reign supreme. There are a few places here that aren't in Europe, but not many. This is pretty much Europe. And so Europe is worse than in the United States, which actually kind of surprises me. I haven't been tuning into this data daily the way I used to, and just watching the newspapers in the United States, you'd think we were the worst of the world, but not really, not in daily cases per million. We're probably the worst in total cases, I'm pretty sure of that, but that's because we have a lot of people. And the countries that have a lot of people have not ever really gotten badly, like India or China. They have a lot of cases, but not a lot of cases per million, especially India has a lot of cases. China reportedly does not have that many cases per million, nothing like the United States. And so we see it again. We see the recession, the receding of the Central South America cluster, not prominently displayed here anymore. Used to be that Brazil and all of Central South America really were looking pretty bad. They don't show up in the top 20 anymore. The United States is still there, but again, best of a bad bunch here at number 20 in the world. Europe, much worse. Let's look at growth rates, though. Where are we headed? Where are we headed? Growth rates. Still, again, I don't have my other graph. I guess I'm going to have to go back and look at that. But we can do a perfectly good analysis just looking at the top 20. At least we can get some kind of analysis. The top 20 in daily cases per million, those countries of the world which have the most daily cases adjusted for population. Same list we were just looking at, in other words. But this time we're looking at that list and we're saying, what direction are they headed? Are they growing? Are they shrinking? And if they are growing or shrinking, what's the rate of change of their growth rate? So, worst case scenario is a country that's growing quickly, let's say more than 20%, and is accelerating its growth rate. I'm pleased to say we have very few of those in the world, at least among the top 20, which are the ones that contribute most of the cases right now. In fact, I don't think we have any of those in the world. Even the United States. No, I'm afraid the United States is one of those. The United States is a sort of textbook worst case scenario right now. The growth rate is more than 20%. It's at 35% per week. That's a very high growth rate. And it's still accelerating. It's still getting higher. A couple weeks ago or a week ago, it was 20%. And before that, well, it was about 20%. But you can see the line goes up. And so the United States growth rate is very high and it's accelerating. So that's just bad news all around. Now, when you look at it in the context of some of these other countries, at least you can see that there are a couple, Lithuania and Austria, that have a larger growth rate than the United States, 45%, 55%, considerably larger than the United States, but they are decelerating. They're getting over it. They're at least trending towards getting over it. So all these countries of Europe, though they apparently went much higher than the United States is now, that was then, and now they're heading towards a recovery. We can't say that they're really heading towards a recovery in the sense of actually seeing shrinking cases daily until they cross this white zero line. 4 of them have, maybe 5. At least Slovenia, Armenia, Czech Republic, and Belgium. And there's another one in there too. It's just mixed right in there so we can't quite see. What is that? Isn't that right? Maybe I'm just, no, I think I'm just blind. I actually do need my glasses, and I might literally stand up and go get them right through this if I run into that again. But yeah, I think it is just the blurriness of my vision that has me think that there are extra lines there. 4 countries are doing quite well. This is the opposite of the United States. They're shrinking, and their rate of shrinkage is rising. They're getting they have fewer cases each day because they're below zero, and the rate at which their daily cases is shrinking each day is changing in the negative direction. They're seeing a dropping growth rate or a rising shrinkage rate, if you like to think of it that way. And there are a couple more, France and Spain, which are very close. Switzerland. In other words, Europe is starting to turn the corner. Some of the many of the countries of Europe have already turned the corner towards negative growth. If we looked at the daily cases per million graph of, say, the Czech Republic, let's just go look at there now, we should see the Czech Republic has already peaked and is starting to fall away. This is going to be one of these, I think. Yeah, so the Czech Republic has peaked. It's clearly dropping now, and that's why we see it below zero. When those lines hit zero, that is the peak. When the growth line hits zero, we see the peak on the daily cases graph. And so here's the Czech Republic. A week ago, almost, crossed the zero line, turned the corner, and peaked and is starting to drop. And every other country, I believe, nearly every other country here, is doing the same. I'm going to pause here for a minute because it seems that my internet is flaking out on me. All right, my internet is now telling me that it's doing better. It looks like I had a brief dropout of Wi-Fi, but it seems to be back. All right, I'm going to check my dashboard here. Excellent connection. Okay, I'm pretty sure that I got lost for part of that. The internet lost me, but I'm back. So what I was saying then is that all of these European countries, or these countries, have crossed the zero line, turned the corner, and are shrinking now in daily cases, fewer cases each day, which is great. And there are several of them that are very close, some that are really right on the line, and then Croatia, for instance, is not too far off. And then there's a whole batch that are really pretty. They're growing quite quickly each day, 25% every day growth, for instance. Or Lithuania, the worst, is growing 55% every day, and that's terrible. Anything over 20% I'm saying, if I'm saying per day, I mean per week. Anything over 20% a week is bad. These numbers are weekly growth rates. Lithuania is growing very quickly, but we see this line dropping. They used to be growing 100% a week. Now they're only growing 50-some% a week. In a couple weeks, we can imagine they'll be growing 0% a week, and they'll turn the corner and finally peak and drop away. So they have not peaked. None of these have peaked, but they're all trending in the direction of peak. Compare that with the black sheep of the family, the United States. As we saw, the United States is growing relatively quickly. It's the third worst of this bunch, and its growth rate is increasing. So there is no predicting the peak from this graph. For all of these ones, which have these nice linear descents towards zero, we can predict. We can actually guess when they're going to peak. For instance, I guess that France is peaking right now, and I guess that Croatia is going to peak in about 4 days maybe. But for the United States, there's no guessing that, because the United States is more like where Lithuania was back here in October 27th, where it was rising. We had no idea if it was going to peak right here on the 29th and start dropping, or peak here on the 31st and drop, or peak here as it actually did around the November 3rd and drop, or keep going up and up for another 6 months. We don't know. The patterns suggest that the United States will probably follow a similar pattern to some of these other countries. Nobody grows forever. They all eventually do peak, but we don't know when that's going to happen. And if they were to follow Lithuania's example, it could be months before the United States peaks. No way to know, other than just to say usually 90 days or something is about the size of one of these bumps. So maybe it's plausible that since the United States started this new rise above zero back in early October, and now it's early November, maybe it's getting to be close to halfway there. It's plausible that the United States will peak soon, but really we can't read that off this graph. We can only guess that off looking at historical graphs of other countries. And the United States is not other countries, and so we don't really know what's going to happen. All right. That's probably enough. I guess I'll briefly look at the worldwide graph, because it's kind of good. The news is kind of good, a little bit good. These are the this is the worldwide growth rate. This is daily growth rate. This is one of my older graphs. Blue background graphs have daily growth rates rather than weekly, and they have all these dots for each day. We can see that the world has never grown at an extraordinary pace as a whole. Some of the worst numbers we've seen are around 2% a day, 14% a week, which, as I've said, is not high enough to be really alarming. 20% is where I start to get worried. And as we saw, there are plenty of countries above 20%, but there are a lot that are shrinking or way below. And so as a whole, the world has stayed below 20% weekly growth. What's the good news here is that there's a very clear and obvious trend downward, where the world was growing at its peak at about 2.5%. Now, the most recent days are more like 0.5%. There's even this very recent day that shows a drop, but that probably is a data anomaly. I won't believe that one for a few more days. So realistically, we can imagine the world as a whole will actually peak in just a few days. Or what's this? From the November 8th to now, yeah, so that's about a week. So maybe within another week, if this trend, which has been sustained and in fact accelerating, even ignoring that point, if this trend continues, we can expect the world's daily cases to peak just in a matter of days. We'll watch that closely and see if that actually happens, but that's good news. And from the graphs we've seen, we can see why this is. The United States certainly isn't helping, but there are 20 countries in Europe that are all pulling this graph downward because they have all peaked and they are all heading downwards, at least in growth rate. This again is just the growth rate, not the total cases. Because the growth rates in Europe have peaked, many of them have actually dropped below zero. Almost all the rest of them are trending towards zero. Because they've peaked, then the world has peaked, because they carry more weight. All the other countries together carry enough weight to pull down the graph, even though the United States keeps going upwards. So good news for the world as a whole. We seem to be pulling out of this couple months spike that was led by Europe and then is now being followed by the United States. Of course, at any time, a new country could come online as the new epicenter. We keep waiting for India to pop in some ways. Sadly, I don't have data for India because my overall graphs are blank right now. But when we've looked at India before, it's this very slow progression, not getting better, but not doing a whole lot worse either. And if they keep going the way they were going a month ago, yeah, actually, I take it back. I'll show you this thing I'm looking at. I don't have the data, but Google does. Cases in India. Yeah, see, I haven't looked at India for a while. India really did peak at 100,000 daily cases, and they've been dropping away. So India has a lot of cases, but by population, they're insignificant. Their cases are very small because they have a huge population. And yet, as I recall, the United States is now doing somewhere like 150,000 a day rate. 150,000 a day. And that's in India's, yeah, that's right, 150,000 a day. India is nowhere near there. They never reached that, and they're now down under 40,000. So with a little luck, India will never become the next epicenter, but it could happen. We sometimes see, especially with very small ripples like this, that don't reach into warm spot or hot spot territory. We sometimes see that, we've seen this in the states of the United States especially, that you can see a little thing that looks like a small wave, and then it looks like they recovered, and then a much bigger wave comes later when they sort of actually get the disease. One just brief note of, I don't know, as I said, I have an optimism bias. And so when I look at this and say, well, yeah, we did have 160,000, but now we only have 135,000, I wonder whether we might be beginning a downward trend. But it's 2 days. 2 days is not enough. 2 days might be a coincidence. 3 days starts to be a pattern. So if we have another day like that, then we could actually say, yeah, maybe the United States is going somewhere. Until then, it just looks like this could totally be part of our normal weekly cycle, which I do not pay attention to. I just have to point it out because I want to give some good news about the United States, which is we don't have as many cases today as we had yesterday or the day before. But by and large, the news for the United States is very bad. Let's see more about that by looking at the states of the United States. Okay, Wyoming's severity probably never really reached 14,000. That is probably a data anomaly. So we're going to take Wyoming out of it. Wyoming is plenty bad, make no mistake, but I don't really believe that. Wyoming, more realistic, is that they're right where they are now, which is 2,500 of severity. In any case, even if they did, due to some incredible spike of cases or a very high short-term growth rate, even if they did hit 14,000 severity, we're going to take them out anyway so we can see the rest of them. So we'll just say Wyoming's the worst. I think that's plausible. They're right in the middle of this, of the epicenter of the epicenter. The United States is the epicenter right now of the world, but North Dakota, South Dakota, and spreading out from there has been the epicenter of the United States, or the center of the epicenter. So what do we got here? Minnesota is the worst right now in severity. South Dakota, the trend here is very, very clear. If you've ever looked at a map of COVID in the past couple weeks, you've seen blotch in the middle, red blotch in the middle. North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, and everyone in anywhere, concentric circles outside of, I would say, South Dakota, roughly. The Dakotas seem to be the seed of it all, or the center of it all, and it has spread outward in concentric circles from there. And so there's a pretty clear pattern here, just as the severity graph for the countries was all about Europe, the severity graph for the states is all about the central northern section of the United States. So Nebraska, South Dakota, Wisconsin, Utah, Colorado, sad to say, which is where I am this very moment here, sitting in my room in Colorado. Colorado had fought off this wave for quite a while. It was surrounded by red on every side on the map. You look at it now, it's as bad as any of them. Colorado is this yellow line here, and it's yeah, it's fifth, sixth worst in the country and rising quickly in severity. So Colorado has come late to the party, but it apparently intends to, I don't know, be the belle of the ball. So, good news here. I sometimes show this other map. Let me see if I can pull it up just to give it sort of a geographic sense. I pull this map from the New York Times. As I've repeatedly mentioned, this is an apolitical podcast, live stream. I recognize the New York Times is a left-leaning outlet, but they have such great data that I present it anyway, but I present it without, hopefully, a shred of commentary or approval or anything on what their headlines and editorial sections say. I'm just trying to show the data, and I don't think I can. Maybe I can drag this tab into here. This will work, won't it? Yeah, I think you can see it here. Okay, here's a map stolen from the New York Times. Let's just try to get rid of some of these headlines. The map is small. I wish they had a big version of this, but this is their front page map. I prefer to the one where you zoom in. You zoom in, you see all the counties. But I don't want the counties, I just want to see the state level. And this map has just been getting worse. It's solid red. The only slightly good news is that the coasts, all of them, including southern, have been doing better than the northern and the inland. Why is this happening now? Well, we back in the day when I made a prediction that we'd never see another wave in the United States, or not as the United States as a whole. That was just 3 months ago, and that is not true. That has not turned out to be true. The things that in that article, in that Medium article where I predicted that, I predicted it based on the trajectories of all the states that had gotten it, and you know, we could see pretty much all states had had a wave at that point. I actually don't really know why this didn't work out. The short answer is all these central states hadn't really had a big wave, or at least if they did, they ended up having a much bigger wave later. But one of the caveats I put in my article at the time was we're gonna have a wave anyway, or we could have a wave anyway, if the school openings infect the whole country, or if winter infects the whole country. Evidence suggests that school openings have not had a huge effect, which is a little surprising. But my guess is that winter has had a huge effect. I do know that in some of the southern hemisphere countries, we saw this effect where the worst of it happened in their winter. So we kind of got to see this coming. In our summer, we could see the waves happening in the southern hemisphere. But, and now it's our turn, I think. There certainly are multiple factors around why this has spread so easily, and I think that the culture of the United States and the freedom thing, both on the left and the right, I hear a lot of it from both sides actually. Those that say that take it from anyway, both sides have it's a cross the aisle thing. Is don't tell me what to do. That I think the United States maybe has more than other countries, and so telling people to mask up, which I do, is not good enough, and in fact gets a reaction from a lot of people from both sides of the aisle. And so we end up with this, where winter comes and people stay indoors with all their friends and family, and they have parties indoors, and they go they eat indoors at their restaurants, and they go indoors at the bars. And I think, if I had to guess, I think this is the main thing that's happened here. Winter came. And that explains why we don't see it in, for instance, California so much, or maybe in as much in Florida or Texas, though Texas is quickly heading into just about as dark a shade as the rest. But my guess is that winter is here to stay for a few months, and my guess is it's going to continue to have a negative impact on our coronavirus rate. What I hope is going to happen here, I'll switch back to here now, is that now that we have such an alarming number of people with the coronavirus because of this new phase, that people are going to get scared and they're going to start being a little more reasonable in the way that they behave in ways that mitigate the virus. I do think that it's pretty much on individuals to do this. Testing is very important. I'm a big fan of widespread testing, but testing or no, we can all avoid the coronavirus by locking ourselves in our basements for 6 months. So that not being possible, we can do whatever is closest to that is practical. By the way, what I've been seeing recently, the mitigation factors are masking, certainly, to protect both others and you, but also don't, if you can possibly avoid it, don't be indoors in an unventilated space for long periods with people who aren't in your household. That seems to be where it spreads. So if you can get rid of any of those, and unmask for that matter, if you can get rid of any of those factors, if you can be outdoors, if you can be in a well-ventilated indoor space, even opening a window, if you can wear masks, that helps, but not enough really if you're indoors long-term without ventilation. Masks alone aren't enough in that circumstance, or if you can make it not long-term. So if you show up to a friend's house for 15 minutes, that's probably okay. But if you hang out with them for 4 hours unventilated, windows closed, that's trouble. And since it's winter, it's hard to open a window, but I've been doing it anyway when there are non-household members in the room. Okay, enough about mitigation. This is more about data, but I do like to stress the importance of mitigation. And it's kind of easy to see why right now, when the numbers have been dropping, I've often been saying, well, things are getting better, but please don't stop doing the things. At this point, I can't in any way say things are getting better, so it's sort of obvious. Do the things. If you're not doing the things, it's time to start. Okay, moving on to daily cases per million. In this case, we actually do have all the states. Definitely got to look at that graph, the country version of that graph, because it's a nice graph. So, what do we got in daily cases per million? Well, Wyoming did report some extraordinarily high numbers there. Maybe they were even real. This graph looks a little more real than the severity graph, but I think the reason the severity graph just went nuts is because Wyoming, in a day pretty much, went from saying we've got 200 daily cases per million to saying we've got 1,200 daily cases per million. And so severity, the metric, freaks out when it sees 500% growth in a day, and suddenly Wyoming has 14,000 severity. But there's, I think, something a little bit suspect about this graph. I very much doubt if Wyoming dropped away for a little bit and then just shot up there. I think probably we could more reasonably draw a line from here to there and say that's the way Wyoming went. And maybe, hopefully, Wyoming really is starting to drop off now. That's, in the very short term, that's about the only good news I immediately see on this graph, is that Wyoming might be recovering, but as we've seen, their data may not be perfectly reliable. South Dakota is a classic example of what we're seeing in this new phase of, really, it's the first wave for South Dakota. They had a ripple back then that at one point I was calling a wave because it got above 100, but sure didn't look like a wave now. Looks like nothing now. South Dakota has shot up to 1,500 daily cases per million. Recall that 200 I consider a hot spot, 100 I consider a warm spot. I don't know what to say about 1,500, and there's no sense that it's slowing. It's just, I mean, maybe it's not running exponentially. Maybe we could say it's going in a straight line now. Maybe there's just the slightest little hook and trend downward, but mostly this is just South Dakota going to hell directly. Do not pass go, do not collect $200. So, nothing good there, and South Dakota is the epicenter, and everyone else seems to be following in their tracks. South Dakota is the cool kid. All the other states want to be just like it, and here we see Wisconsin trying pretty hard. Wyoming, Nebraska, same thing we've seen. It's all those central states. Sadly, very sadly for me sitting here in Colorado, it's very sad to see Colorado so prominently featured in the top 20. Colorado, again, was late to the party, but they seem determined to make up for lost time. 200 here, or 20, these 20 are still mostly that central cluster. We see a little bit of concerning stuff with things like Michigan, which didn't seem to have it quite as bad as the rest, but it's right there in the middle now. Also, and Rhode Island has been a very odd duck indeed for this entire time. Rhode Island had this ridiculous spike. I remember when I thought that was just crazy high, because look at everyone else. In the days of New York and New Jersey, now Rhode Island is back again, trying to make their curve look just like South Dakota. Haven't quite managed, but they're trying. So yeah, the general picture here is everyone's over 450. 200 is a hot spot. So all of these states are hot spots and growing rapidly. There's none of them showing any kind of drop, except maybe this weird hook in Wyoming that I don't quite believe. So no good news on those states' fronts. Let's just look at a few of our favorite states as well on the total graph. California, I spend half my time there too. California is still not a hot spot. California has been standing against this typhoon for a while, but it looks like it's about to be blown over. It did drop into out of warm spot territory, but now it's headed upward rapidly. So California definitely has something to worry about. Not in the realm of those top 20, which recall were 450 or more, up to 1,500, but it's halfway there, halfway to, well, not really actually. It's only 175. It's a third of the way to. Let's just show for comparison, before you get too alarmed, how does it compare to South Dakota? Just so you know, Californians, this is how it could be. You could live in South Dakota. But that said, this is not a good graph. This is not a good trend. We have a long time, though, to put a lid on it before we become South Dakota. Can we do it? We'll see. Texas, as always, it always amuses me to see how closely Texas's graph matches up with California, given how different those states can be in other ways. But there's Texas, definitely a hot spot, 300, but not in the company of the really, really hot spots that we were seeing a lot of. You can look at Ohio briefly. Ohio, also very much a hot spot, also shooting off upwards, and as is Texas. Kind of everyone is rising right now. I don't know if I were to go through all the states. Maybe I will, just briefly. Is there any state that isn't rising? Arizona. That is not acceptable. Arkansas, that data. Delaware, we sort of lost data from at one point. I may start, one of these days, if I get motivated, I may start pulling down data from the New York Times data set, which apparently is publicly available. Corona Data Scraper does well, but I think New York Times does better. And I could make my graphs based on their data set. Well, Georgia. See, I just don't know what to say about this. There's just no way that Georgia is at 3 daily cases per million. We see them red in New York Times. So some of these states just, they don't have a volunteer working for Corona Data Scraper. Hawaii is looking pretty good, and generally their data has been pretty solid, I think. So maybe Hawaii, by virtue of not being on the mainland, has somehow managed to avoid this. Yeah, no recent data for Indiana. Most of these are just rising. Actually, Louisiana isn't so bad. Louisiana is one of those, one of the southern coastal states that have avoided it. And I guess I never quite finished my thought. One of the reasons I think that coastal states have it better is because coastal states don't tend to have as much winter. Don't tell it to the Atlantic Northeast. They would probably say they have winter. But if you go down to much of the West Coast or Gulf of Mexico, when you have an ocean next to you, it mitigates some of the extremes of temperature. And so that may be part of why. I'm living in California myself part of the time. I know that I can go outdoors right now. It's November and I can go outdoors. I don't have to wear a coat. And so I'm not being forced indoors with possibly infected people. Maine, Maryland. Yeah, all right. I don't think I'm going to go through the whole list, but we have found precious few that don't look a little bit like this. Here's Michigan. Michigan it did so well for a while there, and now look at it. Poor Michigan. 500 plus, strong hotspot. Minnesota, of course, is right in the middle of it. Something like Mississippi isn't in the middle of it. We'd expect it to do a little better. And so it is. It's rising, though, but only up to 350. And Missouri, Montana, maybe I'm going to go through all of them. Maybe just handpick a few others. What about Pennsylvania? Yeah, I mean, Pennsylvania is pretty far from that center, but it too is just off the rails. So you can look at these graphs yourself at gregfarrar.us. You can just double click on any of these to see your favorite state. But all of them, pretty much all of the states of the United States are rising and looking pretty bad. I'm definitely running out of time. I may not have much time to look at California, but let's take a look at growth rate. There's Wyoming, right? As we noticed, Wyoming had apparently a 500% spike in a single day. Probably not real, but my graph doesn't know that, and so it has this outrageous spike here. We're going to take out Wyoming, just assume that the surrounding states will cover it. It is kind of interesting to me that the worst spikes, other than Wyoming, are historical ones. We have a pretty tight cluster here, which I guess is kind of good in a certain sense. It means there are no states that have had outrageous growth, like 500% or 200 or 300% growth, but they're all growing steadily. Recall that the countries we're starting to show, of Europe especially, the worst countries, we're starting to show this clear downward trend here at the end of the graph as they started to see lower and lower growth rates. They're still growing, most of them, but their growth rates were dropping. We're not seeing that for the states, not for many of them. We look at one like Alaska. Alaska is definitely seeing that. Used to have a growth rate of 40%, now it's down to 20. Also, we see that with, who's this? South Dakota, which was very hard hit and had a growth rate for a really long time in the 20s, but now finally has cracked down below 20. So that actually is maybe some of the best news on this graph, is that the epicenter of this thing, which grew outward in rings from the Dakotas, the epicenter, the Dakotas, South Dakota, is actually shrinking in growth rate and is trending towards a peak in perhaps 2 weeks. It's hard to say because it's sort of flattening out at the very end here, but if this trend continues in South Dakota, we may actually see South Dakota's daily cases peak in 2 weeks. Still a long time, and they have a huge number of cases per million, so it's not really good news, but at least it shows a hint that we may be heading towards a better place for the center of the epicenter. But everything else here, almost everything else, is either growing, and take this one for instance, well, that's Guam. Guam sort of lives in its own world, literally, off in its own little island. Tennessee, though, is rapidly growing. Minnesota, right near the epicenter, you could make an argument that it's peaking in growth rate, but it's much too early to say when they'll ever actually peak in daily cases. They're still growing at 60% a week. Crazy talk. And then Colorado, 50% a week. Again, we could argue that they've at least plateaued at 50% a week, but 50% a week is a terrible growth rate. It's the second worst of this very shady crowd we got here, the top 20 DCPM. Nebraska, again, maybe growing a little bit, but peaking and dropping a little bit, but the long-term trend is clearly upwards. We'll see. In someone like Ohio here, not in the epicenter, but caught it a little bit later and was running at a 30% growth rate and is now up to a 50% growth rate. Ohio's doing terrible. This is exactly what we don't want to see anywhere, which is a very high growth rate of 50% and accelerating. So Ohio is really one of the worst ones on this graph right now. It's got this very consistent upwards growth rate with absolutely nothing to suggest that it might be peaking. Whereas a lot of the other ones at least show us a sign of possibly wiggling towards plateau or downwards. Here's a nice wiggle. Utah, not growing as much as it used to be, maybe plateauing. So we're starting to see what I guess are the early signs of a plateau of this, in growth rate of this latest epidemic. Will it actually go there? It's hard to say. This is kind of a big snarl of yarn, and who can really say? You could just as easily pick out ones that are clearly going upwards, like Ohio, as the ones that are clearly going downwards, like Alaska. So it's a mixed bag, but there are some possible signs of hope. The big picture here, though, is that no one's shrinking. All of these are growing. They're all above zero and have been for a long time, weeks and weeks now. We have the occasional slight dip below zero by one state, but the cluster, the United States as a whole, the worst 20 hottest states have all been growing and are still growing pretty rapidly. We've been doing this for months now, and no obvious end in sight. So that's bad news for the states of the United States. All right, I'm going to just take a little bit of time on the counties of California. Don't have too much time left in my usual plan to finish in 50 minutes, but let's, I never finish in 50 minutes anyway. Let's go to the counties of California. I'm going to pop in on my streaming dashboard and see what's going on. All right. I still seem to be having some sort of internet issues. I hope this isn't just a complete loss. I'll just keep talking. So, counties in severity. I'm going to zoom in because there's some wild stuff here. I want to kind of keep Kings there because that probably is real. Kings and Imperial, the royal couple, do have a history of doing crazy bad stuff on these graphs, and here they are. Kings is the worst again. Imperial is still in the top 20 in severity. Other really bad ones, I cannot pronounce this. Tuolumne. I shall have to figure that one out. San Luis Obispo, Napa, San Bernardino, Sutter. Generally, everything we see here, these are all bad. They're all above 200. But if you remember some of the other graphs we've seen for states and countries, these aren't super, super bad. They're just bad. We're not seeing numbers in the thousands. We're not seeing numbers in the tens of thousands. We're only seeing a smattering above 400. But still, these are all hot spots. Every one of these counties is a hot spot in severity. So here we see California, which was doing quite well, had no hot spots at all, at least of these 20, back in October, has really lost its grip and is heading in the same direction as the South Dakota cluster, the Dakotas cluster. As it spreads outward, it seems to be hitting California. Now, as we saw, there's just a hint of a sign that the center of the cluster might be recovering now, might be heading towards recovery. And if so, we may see that recovery spread outwards as well, and California may go through a phase like South Dakota, but then end up recovering in the same way that we hope that it will. But again, that's very speculative. We don't know what's happening with these. All the states could continue to rise indefinitely. I will say that one of the reasons that I expected there wouldn't be a second wave is because I expected the vaccine would come and put a lid on the second wave. And it does look like that really is going to, well, the vaccine is probably going to come. We're certainly getting good vaccine news. A couple of different vaccines, both showing phenomenal success rates, neither approved, but if those get approved and if people actually take them, that will be enough to stop this thing in its tracks. But it'll take a while to manufacture enough for people to be able to take them. But still, even in the first million doses, if they're put in just the right place, so the first million doses probably is enough. If you're very selective about where you put them, you may be able to start to see a noticeable effect on the graph. And as we get to the point where everyone can be vaccinated if they want to, and we get to the point where maybe 50% of people actually will be, then we'll see some real differences here, even if it is winter. But the news in California is bad. It's just not monstrously bad like it is other places. Let's look at the daily cases per million. This is all the counties. Do I not have a top 20? I think I remember this. I'd forgotten that I don't have a top 20 daily cases per million graph. That's strange, but that's fine. The top 20 are just the top 20 here. It just makes the graph a little more muddled. On the other hand, we do get to see here what's the overall trend for the state. And the trend is most counties are below this the 200 mark, which is to say they're not hot spots. We have only a handful of hot spots, maybe 8. Most of them are not hot spots, and quite a lot of them aren't even warm. The worst ones are Kings and Imperial. Big surprise. San Bernardino, Tehama, Tuolumne. I really didn't. I'll have to learn how to pronounce that if it's going to start showing up in my graphs. It's just shot up from not ever really being on the radar to being arguably number 5. And it's got a pretty bad situation there, though it's still just barely above 200. So compared to the worst in the world or the worst states, it's only sort of bad, I guess. Napa, Los Angeles, sadly, back into hotspot territory. Sutter, San Luis Obispo, and others. You can see, again, go to gregfarrar.us if you want to look at these graphs yourself. You can do all the clicking and find out what your county is doing. In the early days of the epidemic in California, Los Angeles was it had the lion's share of cases. In fact, if we go to the top, to the graph that I never look at, that's not even the top anymore, this graph, we can see that in total cases, Los Angeles still has the lion's share of cases. Nothing else is even close. So this has not been a problem, or it's almost been a good thing, as Los Angeles recovered. The state as a whole recovered, because the state's cases were pretty much Los Angeles' cases. And the downside of this is that if Los Angeles unrecovers, as it seems inclined to do here, the state will also follow. So we'll be seeing California become a hotspot fairly shortly, if Los Angeles stays a hotspot and gets even worse. Even if this whole snarl down here never gets bad, Los Angeles alone can pull the state into hotspot territory in daily cases per million. Finally, let's take a look at the growth rates. This one, I do have a top 20 report, and it's not good. The top 20 counties of California look rather like the top 20 states. We have some very high growth rates. San Luis Obispo at 87, Napa, yeah, I'm not going to try to pronounce that for a third time. That one, worst of all, at 100%. And just a whole lot of them above that 20-some mark. There are 10 or 15 counties that are growing at more than 20% a week, which is really quite bad. And then maybe more problematic is almost every line on this graph is trending upwards. So not only are the cases rising, but the growth rates are rising. If they had 20% last week, they'll have 25% the coming week growth, 30% the next week, 40% the next week. That's what these graphs are indicating. So right now, there's really no good news in California. Yuba, for whatever reason, is bucking the trend a little bit. And no, that's not the one. Yeah, that's it. That's pretty much it. We have, a few, maybe you could say Los Angeles. No, Los Angeles is spiking upwards, not spiking, but trending slightly upwards. Los Angeles at 20% has just gotten into a real troubled range, though it did recover for a while, so it's not terrible. But still, the general trend is California counties are not only growing in cases, there are none of these shrinking, they're all above the zero line, but their growth rates are growing. So this is everything we hate to see in a graph. California definitely in trouble right now. We can look at the counties as a whole, just briefly to say, same deal. There's pretty much no county that's shrinking in daily cases right now. All the counties are growing, and the general trend of this whole rope, definitely upwards. It was even a month ago, California was generally shrinking, most counties shrinking. That is no longer the case. We have some really extreme counties, but that are growing really badly, but the middle of the rope is somewhere near 30%, and that's just not a growth rate we want to see. So probably again, maybe it's winter, maybe it's these winter in the other states that are gradually infecting outward to California, but California is in trouble. Not really any good news to present here. So that's my live stream. I will end on the only happy news that I have, which is that among the worst countries of the world, to remind, the worst hit countries of the world, almost all of them are trending downward in growth rate. Almost all the countries that are currently worst hit, which basically means Europe, are getting better in growth rates. Many of them have turned the corner, and all of them are heading towards turning the corner, with the exception really of the United States. The news in the United States is exactly the opposite. All the states are growing and all pretty much accelerating. All the counties of California are growing pretty much accelerating. So I guess I'll have to keep doing these because we're not done with this epidemic yet. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. I'm Greg Farrar, and you can watch look at my graphs and navigate through them yourself on gregfarrar.us in the long gaps between the live streams that I've been doing recently.